Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Carmichael Clan Radio, the official podcast of the Carmichael Clan USA. I'm your host, Scott Carmichael. On today's show, the Clan Carmichael USA newsletter editor Leah Hargrove talks with West Point professor of history and 100 Years' War scholar Dr. Clifford Rogers about the Battle of Baugé of 1421. They begin with a fascinating discussion about the history of the garter, or belt, that appears in almost every family and clan crest, and then move to talk in depth about the Battle of Baugé. For Carmichaels across the world, the Battle of Baugé is one of the most significant events in our clan history, and is the battle from which we were presented our family crest that depicts a broken spear, symbolizing the dehorsing of the Duke of Clarence, who was the brother to Henry V, by Sir John Carmichael. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to remind everyone that the redesigned Carmichael Clan USA website is up and running. You can now join or renew your membership to Carmichael Clan USA from the website. Find out more about the Carmichael Clan's history, as well as learn about what's going on now in the Carmichael Clan and how you can become more involved. The new site is a huge improvement from the old site, so at the very least, go take a look around and let us know what you think at www.clancarmichaelusa.com. And now let's get started with the show.
Professor Rogers, this is Leah Hargrove. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm super excited to talk to you today. Thank you. So, you said in your email that you had recently published a joke related to the garter in the Carmichael family crest, and I was very intrigued about it.
Well, so of course the garter in the Carmichael family crest is the same as everybody else's garter. There's, tons of crests with garters.
Mm-hmm.
And that all comes from, I think it's fairly obvious that all comes from the order of the garter in England. So nobody really knew why there was a garter in that, why the order of the garter was the order of the garter. They knew why there were crests with garters, and there are a million of them. I think Budweiser has one. But nobody really knew why Edward III, who founded the order in 1348, had picked that as the symbol for the order, and that always...
I have always wondered.
Yeah. And it seems strange to people, and in the 15th century, actually, or maybe even in the late 14th century, there were stories that started to circulate that it was about a ball, and one of the ladies of the court lost her garter and it fell down, and he picked it up and then said, as it says on the garter in the order of the garter symbol, "Ani soit qui mal y pense," shame on he who thinks evil of it. But it was totally a story that was invented to explain. It was sort of going from the symbol and making up a story to make sense of it, like you would do in a myth. But it wasn't true at all. And the reason they came up with that story, and the reason they were so puzzled, is because even by the late 14th century, and certainly in the 15th century, a garter was as it still is, an item of women's underclothing, and therefore seemingly very strange choice of the symbol for a chivalric order. But actually, in Edward III's youth, and even still in 1348, both men and women wore garters to hold their hose up, and men wore them because they usually had short surcoats. They would wear them visibly. So there are a number of garters in royal financial accounts that were purchased for Edward III and his relatives that are, jeweled and cloth of gold and so on. They were very fancy, and because they were meant to be seen. And the Duke of Lancaster, who was Edward III's sort of chief lieutenant, wrote a Livre de Saint Médecin, a book of holy medicine, which was a allegorical treatise about how to ward, to keep evil out and be a good Christian, basically. And one of the things he mentions in there is how, as a youth, in vanity, he was very proud of how his garters set off his calves. And so, like I said, it wasn't an item of women's underclothing, so that whole story is nonsense. And then you're back to, well, so why do they have garters? And if you think about it, what is the definition? How would you define a garter?
Let's say something that holds up articles of clothing on your legs.
Right, something, but what?
A band, a belt, perhaps.
Exactly. It is a band that holds something up. And that is what the order of the garter was. It was a band of knights who upheld Edward III and particularly his claim to the French throne. And so the motto, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," is shame on him who thinks ill of, what's the E? What's the it? It's
the claim to the throne.
Throne, yeah.
Very fascinating. Thank you. I have always wondered about the order of the garter and was familiar with, the fact that men and women both wore them at some point, but it still seemed like a sort of insignificant piece of clothing to base the chivalric order around.
So it's a pun, and there many of the other orders of the time also used puns and also variations on. So there was an order of the knot, for example, Knot, and it's both it's the same idea of the ties that bind or uphold, and of course the garter is depicted as a knightly belt, really, is why it takes that particular form of a garter. So there's a lot of symbolism in it, but the core is that it's a band that upholds, which, by the way, is a pun that works both in French and in English, and Edward III was bilingual.
Oh, that's also fascinating. What would be the word for garter in French?
Jarretière, but that's not the pun part. The pun is that a band is also
a band. That's the same, certainly.
Right.
Well, I think that's very. I'm fluent in French, although my pronunciation it's pretty heavily Southern American still, and I really enjoy, particularly looking in words related to the nobility, how much back and forth there is. Well, I suppose probably not so much forth from the English, but how much French that there is in English. So anyway, that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm an amateur linguist, and I really enjoy learning those kind of things.
I don't know if you know this, but Edward III, who reigned from 1327 to 1377, is actually the first king of England after the conquest that we know spoke English.
That's fascinating. I knew it was a long time before the Norman kings began to pick up in English, but I did not know it was that long. I mean,
now it's possible that some of the others did. It's just we don't have any evidence that they did.
Okay, that's who's confirmed.
Yeah, with Edward III, he actually had personal mottos that were in English, and he allowed the use of English in the law courts for the first time since the conquest.
When we're thinking then, sorry, I'm getting off track, but I have to know now. Edward Longshanks, that's the second, right?
That's the first.
He's the first. That's right. Okay, Edward the First. So it might have been unlikely then that he spoke much English. I mean, I suppose he could have, but
right. It's quite possible. I would put it this way, that we have no evidence that he did, and it's quite possible that he didn't.
Mhm. That's just so interesting to me because as a Scot, he's really the quintessential bad guy.
Yep.
But
sure.
to think of him really as, and I'm sure as he thought of himself as more of a Frenchman, or at least more of a Norman than as an Englishman.
Yep.
It's so fascinating. So I was brushing up a bit on the 100 Years' War before I called you because I didn't want to be completely ignorant about the surrounding events of the battle. And even though of course it's called the 100 Years' War, I was still blown away about just how much history is involved in there. I lived for a while in Angers, France, and became familiar with the Plantagenet family, and of course all their famous descendants, and so many of those names kept cropping up, and a lot of famous, of course, English combatants, and then all the way down to Joan of Arc, who's one of my favorite humans that's ever existed. It was crazy just how many big players were involved in this back and forth between England and France over this time period. Absolutely, it's nuts. It's funny you're talking about the crest, and obviously for Carmichaels, that's our, I think, like I mentioned, our big claim to fame, that we were presented the family crest, so the family legend goes, by the French, because Sir John Carmichael unhorsed the Duke of Clarence at this skirmish. But I was just talking to my dad, and my dad was in London a few years ago, and he said that up in the Tower of London, there's some sort of model. I don't know what it's made out of or how old it is, but there's a model of that skirmish and the unhorsing of the Duke of Clarence. And the description of the model describes the man that unhorsed him as a Frenchman, and not as our family, and it just assumes that everybody knows, was a Scottish Carmichael. And so my dad said, well, be sure to ask Professor Rogers, just how sure are we that Sir John Carmichael did the unhorsing? Because clearly in the Tower of London, where you think the experts would be, they've attributed it to a Frenchman. And I don't know if that's kind of some politicizing after the fact to make it look better, have a better light on the English, or not. Or if there is some dispute that the Duke of Clarence was unhorsed by a Scotsman at all.
I have not researched that question, but from my recollection, there is some dispute about who killed him, and there are several elements to that, including that it was a Frenchman. But I didn't think there was any dispute. Now, to say that there's no dispute doesn't mean that everybody agrees. It just means most sources are silent, right? There is a source that says that Carmichael did it, and I don't think there's any source that says he didn't.
That's about what I've seen too, and like you said, there are disagreements about who actually did the killing, which kind of brings me to a next question. So, I know from doing my research on the battle and battle, of course, is a strong word, but that the Duke of Clarence rushed into it and was ill-prepared and didn't take as many men as he should have taken. And so in my mind, I'm trying to picture a little bit about what it would have looked like. I know there was a bridge, and the Scottish armors kind of held off the English for a little while until they crossed the bridge. But then at some point, there is this seminal moment for my family where there are two knights on horseback with lances. Would it have been pretty common during this time period that while like a battle is raging on, that knights would be charging each other across the field? I feel like, most people's exposure to it is American movies, where sort of everybody stands back while the knights do their thing. What would it really have looked like if somebody had been there?
Yeah, so there are medieval battles at which there are sort of like the duel between champions, between the hosts, between the armies, but this wouldn't have been one of them. So the normal way. So in the 100 Years' War, by this point in the 100 Years' War in particular, in the 15th century, when it came to actual battles, the fighting was mostly done on foot, even by the men at arms. So at the Battle of Agincourt, or just a little bit before Baugé, for example, all of the English men at arms were fighting on foot. So the men at arms are what you would think of as the knights. Actually, most of them are not knights, because knight is a pretty high social rank and economic rank. And by the 15th century, most are actually esquires. But the guys with armor and horses and the ability to fight on horseback, whether they're actually knights or not, are called men at arms, which you would know in French as gendarmes.
Mm-hmm.
So at the Battle of Agincourt, all of the English men-at-arms fought on foot, and 90% of the French men-at-arms fought on foot. And then the other 10% tried overrunning the English archers on horseback, and all got just shot to bits. So that's one of the main reasons why everybody was fighting on foot by this point. French is because the horses were too vulnerable to arrows, whereas by this point, men-at-arms were wearing basically full plate armor, and while they weren't completely invulnerable to arrows, they were also not super vulnerable to arrows. So most arrows that hit a guy wearing full plate would just glance off or barely penetrate and not do a lot of damage. But if you were on a horse and your horse gets shot, your horse is not going to be fully protected the way a man can be. So therefore, it was better to fight on foot. So the Scots had done this. They'd been fighting the English, obviously in England as well as and in Scotland as well as in France for a long time, and they knew all about that. There had been a battle just about a decade earlier, I guess, where almost 2 decades earlier, where the Scots had gotten a bunch of really good armor from France and thought that would be good enough, and they found out that although they were not as vulnerable, they were still vulnerable enough, and they lost. So probably the way that the Franco-Scottish men-at-arms would have prepared to meet Englishmen charging towards them would have actually been on foot with their lances pointing forward, basically almost like a Greek phalanx. And if they saw Clarence and the other English men-at-arms charging them on horseback, which was a very unusual thing for the English to do in an actual battle, even more than the French, right? I mean, there were some battles where the French, like at Agincourt, at least some of them were charging on horseback, same at Poitiers or Crécy, whereas the English normally fought entirely on foot. But in skirmishes and meeting engagements, both sides might well launch a cavalry attack and try and get advantage of surprise, as happened here. And so this was kind of a real turnaround, that here the Franco-Scottish army was on the defense, not the offense, and that the English were not only attacking, but attacking on horseback. And so the natural response would have been to as you may sort of be familiar with from Bannockburn, for example. It's the same basic idea. You form a solid formation and you face pikes or lances outward. You ground the lances, and if the horsemen charge you, then you will probably run away because it's very scary. But if you don't run away, then the horseman to impale himself on your, and that could very well be how he broke his lance, rather than in a joust. But it could also have been so if you were, if the Franco-Scottish army was on the march and Clarence gets wind of them and charges towards them, it would also be a very credible response for if you had, a few of your men-at-arms mounted to essentially countercharge and try and slow them down and buy time for the men behind you to rally, and especially with the bridge, that would make sense in terms of that's basic tactics is if you've got sort of a hard shell defense, and if you can put somebody to counterattack behind it, cavalry is very good for that. So as somebody breaks through the Scottish archers by the bridge, they're out of formation, they're disordered, and then you counterattack them with a cavalry attack in order. That would also be a way that could easily have played out. Now, as to which of those it was in this case, I would have to, I think it's Bauer's Scotochronicon that describes that, and although I should have tried to read that again before you called, I didn't. But I can check on that and let you know.
Sure, thank you. That would be fascinating. Certainly for the Clan Carmichael, we prefer to picture it as two knights in resplendent armor charging each other across an empty field. But I suspected that was probably more fantasy than it was reality. Anyway, whatever the truth is, I'm sure it's fascinating and probably buried under many layers of history. You had mentioned the Scottish archers, and I'm curious because I know that the English archers were just a devastating force, and that the only reason this skirmish really went in the French and Scottish favor is because Clarence left his. So two questions of that. How did Scottish archers at the time compare to English archers? Because certainly they were engaged with each other a lot and were close to each other. By this time, had they caught up in skill and technology? And why did Clarence leave his archers if they really were the strength of the English army?
Well, because he was a fool. Is the short answer. So it was basically an idea that by going forward. So one of the things is that in this whole phase of the war after Agincourt, the French tended to avoid battle, and so it's a little bit like Custer at Little Bighorn. He was like, okay, I got to go forward, I got to charge, I got to get them before they get away. He was more worried about them getting away than he was about them beating him. And so with his mounted men-at-arms, the English could just basically charge forward at speed and try and take the advantage of surprise and make sure that they engaged before the enemy got away. And so he's underestimating his enemy, basically. And, if he'd been right and he'd sort of hit them and they all then ran away, then he wouldn't have needed the archers. But he wasn't. So that would be why, so that didn't answer your other question about how effective were they. So it's not a matter of technology. The technology is a stick. And there would be no difficulty in, except maybe in getting long enough staves of yew, which the English were importing, and they were getting pretty expensive, and the Scots didn't have so much money. The problem with having a really strong bow is not the bow; it's the archer. It's having somebody strong enough to use a really strong bow. And the English had that as essentially their national sport, right? It's what everybody did for their hobby. And there were laws that said you should do that every Sunday after church and not play golf or soccer because that would just be a distraction. So the English really it had become a cultural thing that you grew up getting stronger and stronger bows as you got older, and the English were famous all over Europe for the strength of their archers. A Italian who visited England in the 1480s met some archers, and this was not, it's just some clerk or something. This was a soldier, and when he met English archers, he was there as an ambassador. He wrote back and he said that these are not men like other men. They have hands and arms of iron. So basically nobody was the equal of the English archers. However, the people who had been, and so actually let me backtrack for one little second there, that the reason that the English bows were so long, and one of the reasons they were so powerful, is because you can only draw an arrow that is half the length of the bow. So if it's a single wooden stave bow like the English and Scottish bows are, as opposed to a composite bow like a Middle Eastern archer might use, because obviously the farther you pull back the arrow, the longer the arrow is, the farther you pull it back, the more your bow has to bend, right? And the longer it, the less bend it takes. I mean, if you think about just bending a twig, you can sort of easily see that, right? And so how far can you bend it before it'll snap? It's about half its length. And so if you have a long bow, you can have a long arrow that you can draw a long draw. So the English archers would draw all the way back to their ears, which is a longer draw than most other people did, which was to their chest or their chin. And so that means you're exerting force, and not only that, but the force is increasing. The farther back you draw, each inch that you draw is harder than the previous inch because you're against more leverage of the spring. And so you're putting in more and more energy. And then, of course, the amount of energy you put in is the amount of energy you get out when you release it. So by this point, the Scots and also the Picards, for example, there were at least some of them also using long bows that were much like English long bows with long arrows, but they just tended not to be as thick. And the thicker it is, the stiffer it is, the harder it is to pull back, the harder it is to pull back, the more energy you store by pulling it back, and the more energy you get in your arrow when you release it. So the Scottish archers at this point were respectable archers and better probably than, say, crossbowmen. So in earlier battles, the French had tended to rely on Italian crossbowmen or urban crossbowmen, but the Scottish archers were certainly effective enough that they could be very effective against the English horses. So in the fight at the bridge, at least according to the Liber Pluscardensis, that was actually the Scottish archers did stop Clarence's cavalry from crossing the bridge by arrow fire, and then Clarence and company dismounted, fought their way across on foot over the bridge. Now they may or may not have mounted back up after getting their way across the bridge. So if they didn't, then the whole story, the whole Carmichael story, kind of is out, and anything you get from a medieval battle when you have one source that claims it, you don't necessarily know if that's really true. And so, for example, also with the Carmichael thing, in Bauer's Scotochronicon, it actually says that a different Scot wounded Clarence in the face with his lance, and then the Earl of Buchan struck him to the ground with his mace. So we don't, honestly, the truth is we don't really know, right? I mean, there are different ways it could have played out. The sources don't really agree with each other. There's no obvious way to say that X source is better than Y source for these particular details. So one can sort of keep your clan story as good as any of the others. And so it is certainly possible that if we take it as read that Carmichael did indeed unhorse Clarence with his lance, that would suggest that Clarence, fought his way on foot across the bridge, remounted, horses carried after him, remounted and charged forward, which is perfectly credible, and then essentially ran into Carmichael, either charging against him on horseback or creating a barrier as part of a formation on foot.
Do we know anything about John Carmichael before this battle? I mean, I realize this is way back, but I struggled to even really kind of find what his standing was in Scotland beforehand.
So short answer is I do not know the answer to that.
I'll accept it.
I believe there was about the same time there is another Carmichael who is actually made the bishop of one of the towns in France.
Orléans, I believe.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Orléans.
Of Orléans? Could be. If that's true, then, and I'm just doing a quick look to see if I can find it, that would certainly indicate that the Carmichaels were, well, that's interesting. Yeah, okay, so apparently that is actually the same John Carmichael.
I wondered, I saw that, and then in the same source I saw that he was likely present at the coronation of the Dauphin a few years later, and of course this really shouldn't be shocking to me for medieval Europe, but it just seems unlikely that you would take somebody off the battlefield and then make him a bishop. I can't imagine the qualifications were always a perfect match.
That is unusual. That's why I thought it was probably it's not unheard of, but it is unusual, and it's also not unheard of for clerics to hang on, let me see. It's not unheard of for clerics to actually fight even though it was
Mhm.
forbidden by canon law. It did certainly happen. Um, so, yeah, but so I'm not going to say. I said that it looks like it is the same one, but that's not in a. I would have to look into it to really see if that's true. But I think the bottom line is there's a clear indication there that the Carmichaels were already prominent in Scotland, and that let's see, and that also the John Carmichael who was involved here, he was clearly there as a man at arms if he was breaking a lance, which Bauer does say. Which would have been, not just like some member of the family, but he would have been a very senior member of the family.
Mhm. Yeah, it was curious to me when I was reading that perhaps he become Bishop of Orleans, and trying to wonder. So I don't know exactly what he was in Scotland, but he certainly wasn't a duke or an earl. He was not
No.
particularly elevated. So I think it would be a major upgrade then to find yourself bishop of a large city in France. And if it was me and I had to pick between going back to the soggy moors of Scotland or staying in Orleans, I would stay in Orleans. Although I wouldn't wonder if at that time I suppose the bishopric would have been a celibate position. Yes.
Yes, certainly should have been.
It should have been. That's right. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Just, yeah, it seems like a very strange jump for someone to make, although it's certainly a high honor to do so.
Yeah, and of course there were, not more than a few, bishops were usually aristocrats, and there were more than a few of them more than a few martial aristocrats who at some point in their careers became more commonly monks than anything else, but sort of retired to a religious life, and some of them then went on to become bishops.
I'm wondering if the I can't remember exactly 12 to 15,000 Scots that went over to France around 1420. How many of them would have been men at arms and sort of, I guess, people of some economic means, and how many would have been regular lay people that I don't know if they would be conscripted or volunteered or what, but I'm just thinking about like the archers. I don't typically, and I could be wrong in this, I don't typically think of an archer as someone very high up in society compared to, say, a gendarme.
Right.
What would the breakdown have been like of all those men going over?
It would have been just a small fraction would have been men at arms. The great majority, I mean, like probably, I would. Yeah, don't quote me on this because I don't. I would have to actually look to see if there are any numbers in the sources, but just sort of give you a sense. It would be surprising to me if more than 1,000 of them were at arms, and the rest archers. Now, when they call them archers, many of those would have been actually archers, but sometimes they would also call people archers who actually were billmen or spearmen. So, for example, because archer was sort of the category, the pay category, essentially.
Okay.
But generally, they probably would have been archers. But archers have been able to, they wouldn't have been just archers. They probably would have had swords and light armor and been able to fight hand to hand under the right circumstances. But the French didn't really need, even at this point, they had lots of men-at-arms. They had more men-at-arms than the English did by far. So I think they would just interested in having more bodies, just more men. But the Scots just didn't have very many men-at-arms at all, even compared to the English, much less compared to the French. It's just too expensive, and Scotland was poor. And so, and whereas the French did not have an archery tradition like the Scots, just basically from proximity and fighting with the English, had by this point come to develop. And so it's not surprising that the French would have been interested in acquiring archers to help counterbalance the English archers.
So was France compensating the Scottish crown in some way for the men being sent over, or was this just out of friendship to the old alliance that I guess at this point was over 100 years old? Was there any? I guess I should just put this way: was there anything in it for Scotland other than snubbing the English?
Okay, so yes, and that's actually complicated because there was definitely nothing in it for the French crown because the King of Scotland was in the English army. He had been captured and was actually serving with Henry V.
Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Scots were led by the king's cousin, a fellow Stuart, the Earl of Buchan, and so it was a recurring problem for Scotland because this was the second Scottish king to be captured by the English, and of course the English had also earlier in the war captured the King of France, John II, and David of Scotland had also been captured. And once the king is a prisoner of the English, the king's main interest is to get out, right? And there are some in Scotland who feel, okay, well, our main interest is to get our king back, right? And then there are other people who don't really think that. It's more, well, he's the king, but, we really have to look out for the interests of Scotland. And then there are other people who don't want the king to come back because as long as the king is in English prison, they're in charge. Makes for some pretty tricky politics. So the French, the Scots who were aiding the French, as you say, were doing so as part of a long tradition, a long alliance, which was indeed founded on. It's not just sticking it to the English or thumbing your nose at the English. It's basically mutual assistance between the French and the Scots to prevent, if the English defeat either one of them, then they can turn their full attention against the other one. There was actually a saying that was supposedly prevalent at the English court, which was that he who will France win must with Scotland first begin. In other words, you got to get your back taken care of if you're going to go fight the French. And of course, from the French standpoint, that means, hey, as long as you keep the Scots in the fight,
so leave us alone.
Right. They'll leave us alone, or at least they won't be able to use their full strength against us. And so that's a main reason why the French continually gave support to the Scots, was to keep them as a thorn in the enemy of my enemy is my friend, keep them as a thorn in the back of the English. And so why would the Scots help the French? Well, again, if the French go down, and in 1420s, the French. This is right after the Treaty of Troyes. Henry V looks like a sort of an unstoppable conqueror, and has just signed a treaty by which, as soon as Charles VI dies, Henry V is to become the King of France, right? And if France and England are united under the same king, there is zero chance that Scotland will maintain its independence. So that's one side of the motivation for, you said, what's in it for the Scots? Another one is, like I said, Scotland is poor and France is rich. So a chance to make good money serving as French soldiers is a popular, that's a pretty good recruiting opportunity. The Scots, there was like a saying in France that the Scots were mutton eaters and wine guzzlers. And you know what? In Scotland, they were eating a lot of oat biscuits and drinking beer and not getting to eat a lot of meat or drink a lot of wine.
Yeah, that would have been an improvement.
Absolutely. Like I said, Scotland is poor compared to England. England is poor compared to France. So, and when you get somebody like, if we do have the right Carmichael, that he does become the Bishop of Orleans, or the Earl of Buchan becomes Duke of Aumale or somewhere like that. He gets a French dukedom. And a number of the other Scots get pretty rich rewards that are way more valuable than their estates in Scotland.
Yeah, for sure. When I was in Angers, I spent a lot of time visiting the Chateau d'Angers, and it was. By this point, I think it must have been close to 200 years old, at least. I think it was built in the 1200s. And it was incredible. It was amazing. And very French, and not just was it a huge fortress, but it was very beautiful and had a beautiful chapel and formal gardens. And Scotland had a long way to go to catch up to it financially. I could see how somebody might be eager to volunteer for an all expenses paid trip to France, even if it included some fighting.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you real quick about the position of being Bishop of Orleans. The thing about that's really interesting to me, beside the status change and the economic change involved, is just the brush up with history and almost with mythology for me, because the source I mentioned that I had been reading said that this Bishop Carmichael was likely present at the coronation of the Dauphin, at which I assume Joan of Arc would have also been present. And she's just such a larger than life figure, and I would assume you please correct me on this if I'm mistaken, but I would assume really compared to Joan of Arc, the Scottish influence at this point in the war was very, very small compared to how she impacted the morale of the French army. what do when historians are looking at this period of the war and looking at Joan of Arc, what's kind of the modern consensus of her impact? Was it mostly just moral, or was a lot of it strategy?
That's actually a debated subject. And I think there's no doubt that a big part of it was to restore morale. The French sort of had a lot of resources, but if you go in with a defeatist attitude, because you can't beat the English and you always lose to them, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if, on the other hand, you've got God on your side, well then you can beat the English. And if you believe,
then you can't lose. Right,
and if you believe that you can beat the English, then you can, right? Or at least you have a good shot. And so that was clearly the most important contribution. But, right, I mean, that's closely bound up with so if Joan is saying, hey, you can beat the English and you should go beat the English and you should attack, right? You should be aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
That is a morale thing, but it is also strategy, right? It is also strategy. Mm-hmm. Go on the offensive, attack, don't stand on the defensive. Keep going into that wall. There the English, put spurs to your horses, you will beat them. That is a form of strategy. And in her retrial, which is, not a source without problems. So, she was a heretic and then burned at the stake, and then later Charles VII had a retrial, a rehabilitation trial, and so at that trial, which we have the testimony of, a lot of her old companions in arms described their experiences with her, and of course they had an agenda. The agenda was to show, being a witch, she's sent by God. So you have to take that into account. But in their testimony, they do say things like she could sight artillery as well as a experienced captain, and that she could ride a horse well as a experienced man at arms, and and give specific instances where she did give good military advice, or at least military advice that turned out to be good, like they get ready to send the boats across the river at Orleans, and then just then the wind shifts and they can. So it's actually almost like prophecy rather than, and in fact it's not just almost like, it is. She's depicted as somebody with a gift of prophecy, as well as foresight, and of course the difference between those two can be pretty thin. So Kelly DeVries, for example, in his book on Joan of Arc, definitely argues that she was important as a commander, not just as a mascot. And I think that I suppose that's probably now the mostly accepted position.
That's interesting. I'm glad she's been rehabilitated in both ways then, for the sake of history. I'd like to just ask you two more questions to be respectful of your time. But I'd like to hear a little bit about your specialties. I've seen that you've written a lot of things about the 100 Years' War, but not exclusive to that. What are your focuses, whether they're personal or professional, and why do you spend so much time on the 100 Years' War?
Well, the 100 Years' War definitely is my specialty. and in fact, really the 14th century part. And it's a tremendous capital investment to become expert about a subject enough to write your dissertation and then your first book. And so once you got it, you write a bunch of stuff because you exercise all that work. You have, as you were working on the initial project, you're also sort of storing up and keeping track of information that is coming from the same sources, but doesn't necessarily apply to the topic you were working on.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to just, you've sort of found it, cataloged it, mentally organized it, and so that's a natural thing to then come back to and do something else that's not the main project, but where you're not starting from scratch. You're able to use the knowledge that you've developed in the first project. And then you tend to sort of broaden out, particularly, you're as a teacher, you have to teach more broadly than what you write about. So I teach a course on ancient and medieval warfare that covers the whole Middle Ages. So that gets me reading about, the Battle of Hastings or
Mm-hmm.
the Crusades or what have you. And then you try and see patterns where what you know in real depth helps you understand better these other things that you don't know in as much depth, but that you have studied and read about and read the sources for, and maybe in ways that somebody who is, a Crusade historian, you might be able to see things about the Crusades that they don't see because what you know about the 100 Years' War, where the sources are more in depth and richer, explains to you, enables you to understand how something works. That is then also when you go to the Crusades, you're like, oh yeah, that's the same as it is in the 100 Years' War, and so I see exactly what's going on here because I have that analogy to connect it to. And so you tend to sort of spread out. And so my first book was Edward III, and then my second was just warfare in general in the Middle Ages from the soldier's perspective. And I've even then, and some of that then carries forward into early modern warfare and tactics in particular, and strategy, which are my main things. And I also teach I teach military history generally. So that, for example, got me reading a lot of Karl von Clausewitz, and I've even written about Clausewitz, a couple of things, and who's a post-Napoleonic theorist, and very useful actually for understanding even medieval warfare. So yeah, but you have to, as I said, the teaching forces you to broaden out, and then you want to make cross connections between what you've studied in the greatest depth and what you're plunging into in new areas.
Sure, I could understand that. When you're teaching cadets at West Point, what do you hope that they take, here in 2021 from studying the 100 Years' War? Mm-hmm. What are the correlations to our current day?
Sure. Well, there are a lot. There's really, I could go on and on. I would say actually the most important thing. So I actually do a senior colloquium that's just on the 100 Years' War with a few students. And the most important thing is not actually learning about the 100 Years' War. It's learning about how to learn about the Hundred Years' War. Because one of the great things about studying medieval history, and this would go for any aspect of medieval history, is you're constantly having to deal with thin and contradictory sources and then try and make sense of them. Like, was it John de Carmichael, or was that the same as this other John de Carmichael? How do I figure that out? Mm-hmm. And so my students are future officers, and in war, the core problem of war, well, that's too strong. There's more than one, but a core problem of war for commanders is the fact that you always have to make decisions based on information that's coming to you that you don't have time to clarify necessarily. So you have to rely on fragmentary and conflicting evidence and make a decision based on it. So the practice of dealing with fragmentary and conflicting evidence is, I think, super useful for cadets. But then there are also all kinds of things where you do see a rhyme or a resonance between the warfare of the 100 Years' War and modern warfare, in a way that actually makes the 100 Years' War in some respects much more useful to study than, say, World War II. Because in France during the 100 Years' War, for substantial portions of it, France is a failed state, and there are pockets of warlords controlling the local area for their own benefit and exercising borrowed authority and violence under some loose affiliation with a government somewhere that actually has very little power or influence over them. So warlordism in Somalia or Afghanistan is actually something that you can learn quite a bit about in terms of what are the questions to ask, not what are the answers, but what are the questions to ask to figure out how it works there, and how you need to focus on how warlords exercise power and how you can break that exercise of power, and how you combine operations of large mobile forces with little pockets of armed men all over the place in their own little centers exercising power locally. So that's a pretty big analogy. You can look at alliances, for example. So the alliance between France and Scotland on the one hand, and between England and Burgundy on the other hand, at this particular period, are really just vital, and understanding how the Duke of Bedford, after Henry V's death, sustained the Anglo-Burgundian alliance for a number of years, and then in the end lost it, and then thereby pretty much lost the 100 Years' War, can have resonance with our understanding of how we need to sustain our connections with our allies today, and what kind of actions down on the battlefield level even can undermine political and cultural alignments that can sustain an alliance.
That's very interesting. Particularly, I think you describing France as a failed state. I would not have thought about it at the time, but you're absolutely right. After the Treaty of Tout, it was divided into three chunks, right? I mean, Burgundy,
yeah, at least
an English
three
chunk, and then the Dauphin. Yeah, at least three, and who knows what else was scattered around.
Brittany was also practically an independent chunk. And of course, actually, and in the English chunk is actually two English chunks down around Gascony and in Normandy. And then into
That's right, there's the southern one.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Bretons they've always been good Celts like the Scots and pretty independent.
Actually, it's funny you say that because actually you're right. It's like the Scots in that there's good Celts and then there's not, right? I mean, so just like in Scotland, you have the Highlanders who are Celtic and speak Gaelic, and then you have plenty of Lowland Scots who are actually English speakers and not particularly Celtic. It's the same in Brittany. There are Breton, Bretonnant who speak a Celtic language and are mainly in the west. And then as you get farther east in Brittany, they're much more French, physically and genetically.
Yes, I was fortunate to visit Brittany when I was there, and I found much of it very similar to me when I was thinking about Scotland as well. Not the least of which was the weather. Clan Carmichael is, as you mentioned, you're talking about Highland and Lowland. Lowland Scot, and I think traditionally border reivers. And as a much younger woman, when I was getting into my heritage and exploring it, I had in my mind the romantic vision that lots of Americans have about Scotland, the Highlanders and speaking Gaelic and wearing kilts. It was a little disappointed when I got to know the Carmichaels more, and it's been a very long time since any Carmichael spoke Gaelic, if ever. We're pretty close to the English border, and I've been Protestant for a long time. Many of the things that I apply to Scotland do not necessarily apply to Carmichaels. So we're really proud to have this chunk of history, where for at least one point we were definitively not English, and supported our French friends in that. So we take what we can get as border Scots. It's not nearly as romantic. Well, I appreciate so much, Professor Rogers, you taking the time to answer my questions on this, and it really cleared up a lot for me, because as you mentioned, there are not a ton of sources, and they can be pretty contradictory. And it's just really interesting to talk to somebody that has a lot of passion about it. I certainly get excited about it, but I'm probably the only person in North Dakota that cares at all. and you obviously, as you said, this is your specialty. You've spent a lot of your time learning and teaching about this. You mentioned that you had some books out, and I'd like to know the titles of them so that I can when I write up this article and put it in I think I told you, but our clan has a newsletter that goes out to all the members, and so in honor of the 600th anniversary of Baugé, we're kind of sending like a special edition one. And I'd really like to be able to direct people to your book so that they can move beyond this little battle into the wider history of the time period. Do you mind telling me the names of your books and where people could find them?
Well, I guess they could find them on Amazon. And the first is War, Cruel, and Sharp, English Strategy under Edward III from 1327 to 1360, which does, by the way, involve quite a bit of war against the Scots. And then the other is Soldiers' Lives Through History, the Middle Ages.
I really like to read that one. I think that would be fascinating. I spent a lot of time in France. If I was able to go around and travel, focusing on the medieval period. And what's that? Why am I forgetting it? The Cluny Museum in Paris. That's the medieval. Yes. Yep. Oh, it's incredible. I could have spent an entire week there.
It is really
such a fascinating period. Okay, there you go. And you mentioned that book earlier. That one focuses more on, I mean, I'm sure it's a large picture, but does it focus more on kind of regular lay people when you talk about soldiers in this period?
Well, I mean, by lay people is, of course, technically people who are not in the church.
That's true. Let me redefine. I should say regular people that were not knighted, not without special titles.
Yeah. So I as much as I can, but the soldiers that we know more about in the Middle Ages are more likely to be knights and up. But yes, it does definitely did what I could to. It focuses on the common soldiers, but in a lot of the Middle Ages, even the common soldiers are, the top 10% of the social pyramid.
Mhm. Which is an interesting thing, I think,
Yes.
vis-a-vis who I consider a soldier today.
Right. Yeah. So, there's that old idea of I'm sure you've heard the phrase of an officer and a gentleman, right? So, of course, a gentleman really means etymologically, and when that phrase was coined, somebody who's well born. And so really sort of what happened as armies grew tremendously in the late Middle Ages and later was that the nobility moved from being, or the gentility moved from being the soldiers to just the leaders of the soldiers. And that's actually one of the biggest changes between the Middle Ages and the modern period.
That's an interesting angle to it. Sorry, it triggers something for me because I started a reading group in I didn't begin it. I'm participating in a reading group that goes through December of this year. It's reading War and Peace, and it's a chapter a day. And of course, that's centered around the Napoleonic Wars, which are when I think about it, and of course, the book is written from the perspective of the Russian aristocracy, and like you said, those guys that are enlisting are becoming officers. They're not foot soldiers, but there were hundreds of thousands of people involved in these conflicts.
Yep.
And it's hard not to think of a lot of them just as bodies when you're using so many. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting off track, but it's just incredible for me to think of the way warfare has gotten to be, and I hope it doesn't stay this way, but where some people at the top are making decisions that treat the thousands and thousands of young men under them as cannon fodder, basically. That's at least how I feel about the Napoleonic conflict. I'm interested to read through the book and see what Tolstoy thinks of it. Anyway, I'd never thought of that before, like you said, that initially being a soldier was probably pretty expensive to get good at and to get the materials for, and it might not have been something that everybody was, not every farm boy was picking up to go do.
No, indeed not. And as you say, the equipment is kind of the key, because in the Middle Ages, almost without exception, although not quite without exception, soldiers provide their own equipment, and their equipment is, often includes a horse and armor, which are very expensive. Whereas in the modern world, of course, the state collects as taxes and provides the soldiers with their equipment, which on the one hand means that they can, pull in a lot more people if they have the money. They're not required to limit themselves to the better off. Even the archers, at least in England, I don't really know to the extent that this is true in with the Scottish armies that came over, but the English archers in the 100 Years' War were mostly mounted archers. And as I said, they had to, be well off enough to provide their own horses generally. You could make it with your captain or advance on wages, that sort of thing. But generally they were people, they had to, it also doesn't do you any good to have a horse if you can't ride. And the people who could ride tended to be the people who were, not at the bottom of society. It was being an archer was more of a, to the extent that you could use this term for the time, it was more of a middle class thing, not a bottom of the peasantry thing.
That's so interesting. I feel like I read something recently, and it was in some sort of archaeological journal, but looking at English archers and how overdeveloped one side of their body was. I thought, that's incredible. That is so much strength and investment, honestly, in just that one arm.
Well, yeah, the English archers, like I said, those bows are just really, really strong. They're not at all like, you might have had experience of in gym class or something. They could be 150-pound draw weight or more.
incredible to think about, especially since with modern ammunition, it doesn't particularly matter what sort of physical strength you have.
Mm-hmm.
But to be a good archer, yeah, it mattered a great deal.
Yes, you had to be very.
Just fascinating. I'm interested to see too. I live near the Grand Forks Air Force Base, and they do a lot of development in drone warfare and training people how to use drones over there. And I think that's another really interesting development to watch, how warfare will move away from really interacting face-to-face conflict at all, at least for nations that can afford it.
Yeah, well, that's possible. I mean, we've been saying that for a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. You know, people kept saying, oh, it's really just going to be planes dropping precision-guided munitions, and then we got to Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, technology is, just because we've been wrong about it before, doesn't mean that's wrong now. And drones and robots are really, they've come a long way.
For sure. I appreciate it so much, and all of us at Clan Carmichael USA are really, really grateful for your input, and we're excited to celebrate this anniversary and bummed that we're not able to go to France.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to help.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Rogers. Have a good night.
Thanks again to our Carmichael Clan USA newsletter editor for taking the time to talk to Professor Rogers and for providing our listeners with this fascinating discussion. As we approach the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Baugé in March, keep an eye out for more information and history to go up on the Carmichael Clan website celebrating this major event in Carmichael Clan history. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the show and get the latest episodes delivered to you. You can subscribe on iTunes and also now on Spotify. If you like what we're doing, or even if you don't, leave us a review. Your 5-star reviews help to promote the show and make it easier for others to find us. And last, don't forget to go to www.clancarmichaelusa.com to sign up for the newsletter and to renew your Carmichael Clan membership for 2021 if you haven't already. Until next time, toujours Prest.